Ms. Sarmistha Dutta Gupta, who is a writer, researcher, curator, literary translator, and feminist activist. She will speak on prison narratives and her story. I welcome you, Sarmistha Dutta Gupta. You please start your presentation.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Lady Brabourne College, Kolkata for organizing this 7-day workshop and for inviting me to speak here. I guess everyone has had a long day and this is the last talk of the day. So let me begin without much ado. In today's talk, I am going to be focusing on women's narrative from prisons, as you know. Let me just try and share screen, otherwise I may not be able to do it later. Just give me a minute, please. I hope it's visible now. Hello,
yes,
can you share the screen?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So I am concerned with women's narratives from prisons, specifically with chronicles of political prisoners belonging to secret revolutionary societies from colonial Bengal. But before trying to hear a few of these women's voices from the 1930s and 40s, I would like to draw your attention to the broader context which shaped these prison narratives and thereby also raise a question of epistemology that seems crucial to me. If we look at the terms of production and transmission of the historical body of knowledge available today around prison narratives in the British period, we cannot fail to notice that the English local language divide in knowledge hierarchy, the prominence accorded to Gandhians, socialists, and Congress workers in most histories of India's anti-imperialist struggle, and the near invisibility of women as political prisoners from such histories all attribute to skewed knowledge in circulation about life in colonial prisons. Research on prison chronicles, specifically the research that is published in English and earns visibility, is heavily based on literature available in English, which happens to be written mostly by well-known nationalist leaders. Their prison memories are usually from the third decade of the 20th century, by which time jailed political workers had come to be recognized as political prisoners, and such recognition meant earning certain rights in prison. Besides, the leaders whose prison testimonies are more often in circulation benefited from certain privileges accruing to them in prison from their social and educational status as laid down by the Indian Jail Reforms Committee, which was set up in 1980. From the 1920s, they were usually put under Division 1 or Division 2 in prison hierarchy, depending upon their social status. Division 1 prisoners were sometimes put in European wards, as happened with the Nehru. In general, quite a few extra privileges accrued to political prisoners in Division 1 and 2 in terms of food, clothing, basic furniture, books, and stationery. And very importantly, corporal punishment was done away with and solitary confinement abolished in accordance with the recommendations of the Jail Reforms Committee. But before these prison reforms came about, members of revolutionary groups arrested from the time of the Swadeshi movement in Bengal and since the Gadar movement in Punjab had suffered severe colonial penology and oppression in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Prison testimonies in Bengali of Satish Pakrashi, Barin Ghosh, Upendranath Bandopadhyay and many others arrested in the Alipur bomb case and all deported to the cellular jail bear witness to the inhuman prison terms they were made to serve. Like bells around necks of bullocks, they had to wear neck tickets cast in iron with their numbers embossed on these and had shackles on their feet too. They did not have the freedom to talk to each other, and penal labor included tasks like oil pressing or stone crushing. Inmates were severely punished each time they failed to produce the daily production targets set by the jail superintendent. Striving against such a ruthless regime of discipline and punish, when these revolutionaries organized a strike in cellular jail around 1911, their demands were understandably very basic: better food, some relief from penal labor, and the right to talk to each other. Hundreds of others who may not have been deported to the Andamans but were imprisoned in the jails of Bengal and other provinces also experienced severe state repression, as recounted in the memoirs of Bhupendra Kumar Datta and others. These prisoners in jails across the country, almost all of whom belonged to secret revolutionary societies at that point of time, conspired to go on a hunger strike in order to draw the attention of the press to their conditions of incarceration during Lord Montagu and Viceroy Chelmsford's visit to Calcutta in November 1970. In response to the hunger strike, the government moved all leaders to jails in other parts of in other parts of the country, hoping to break up the strike. The strike continued nevertheless for several weeks, well into 1980. The strikers felt partly vindicated when the Indian Jail Reforms Committee, constituted in 1918, and they suggested reforming of prisons on humanitarian principles. In the next decade, the thousands who were arrested across the country for participating in mass anti-colonial struggles came to be recognized as political prisoners, and their basic entitlements changed in a major way. This hierarchized prison system with political prisoners at the top rung was a world apart from the time Aurobindo Ghosh spent a year in jail in 1909, when he remembers having received the same treatment as my fellow convicts, quote, as my fellow countrymen, farmers, ironmongers, potters, the domes and the bagdis, in matters of food, accommodation and prison regulations, unquote. With a new categorization, the non-political convicts, who almost always came from a different social class and a majority of whom were also marginalized by caste, were treated a lot more harshly and had to perform menial tasks and run errands for the political prisoners. There were, of course, exceptions to this, and sometimes members of secret revolutionary societies, considered to be far more dangerous by the British, continued to be put under third division and subjected to rigorous penal labor even in the 1930s. Though there were brutal outrages on prisoners in the Hijli detention camp in 1931 and also in a couple of other jails in the last 3 decades of British rule in India, in general, the prison sentences that political workers of all hues served from the 1920s seem lighter and their conditions of captivity considerably better in comparison to what the earlier inmates had endured. I believe that the significantly altered conditions for political prisoners gave them time and space for reading, writing, and reflection, which in turn enabled them to record their jail experiences from within the walls of the prison itself. Sitting in their cells, some of them, like Jawaharlal Nehru, went on to write hugely acclaimed autobiographies. Quite a few of them made new political choices through readings and critical evaluation of their own work. Most of them belonged to the middle and upper classes and upper castes, and coming in day-to-day contact with ordinary prisoners of oppressed social groups had a profound impact on them. That is why perhaps later prison narratives turned the prison into what David Arnold calls, quote, a significant site for the observation and representation of the subaltern classes, unquote. This is in sharp contrast to the earlier testimony. As we already know, prison circumstances were hardly conducive to reading, writing, and observation of the subaltern before the 1920s. The earlier narratives, written mostly in Bengali and other Indian languages, capture the inhuman ordeals the prisoners were subjected to in prisons after they were released. The focus here is not on the subaltern, but on bitter struggles with prison authorities and resistances to colonial oppression. Each instance of defiance and subversion is reclaimed through detailed description in writing, underscoring the prisoner's contribution to anti-colonial struggles through bringing about changes in the prison regime. But unavailability of English translations of these narratives by members of revolutionary groups, both of the earlier and later generation, a heavy reliance of scholarship on memoirs written in English by celebrated leaders who served milder sentences, an exclusion of the female voice with the exception of elite All India figures like Vijayalakshmi Pandit, have influenced the transaction and dissemination of research largely in the public realm. Lives of those who resisted the most severe prison repression in colonial prisons, some of whom lost their minds and spent years in mental asylums, or chose to end their lives or died due to medical inattention, are completely obliterated from discourses on prison literature. In the last decade, Mushirul Hasan had published 2 volumes, one of them entitled When the Stone Walls Cry, unravels previously unknown of the Nehrus and how that transformed their vision and character. The other volume, called Roads to Freedom, explored the lived experience of some political prisoners, most of whom were very prominent leaders like Gandhi, Maulana Azad, Sarojini Naidu, and former revolutionary turned radical humanist M.N. Roy, all of whom wrote in English. Shatotru Sen's seminal work on colonialism and convict society in the Andaman Islands examines the first 4 decades in the history of the Andaman penal colony and focuses on the lives of ordinary convicts between 1857 and 1898, that is, until the construction of the cellular jail. Lives of political prisoners deported there in the first 3 or 4 decades of the 20th century is outside the scope of this important work. The accounts left by the prisoners themselves are available, but mostly not in English. And also yet to come across a single published work on lives of political prisoners in the Buxa Fort prison in the forests of North Bengal and in Deoli prison in the deserts of Rajasthan in the 1920s and 30s. I wish to suggest that for new readings and generation of knowledge around both her stories and his, we need to question such knowledge hierarchies repeatedly. It is up to posterity to research and reclaim these histories, as Surajit Thapar Bokart has done in her book Women in Indian National Movement, Unseen Faces and Unheard Voices, where there is a detailed discussion of the colonial prison and women prisoners of the United Province. Without such questioning and unearthing of buried letters, diverse prison chronicles would remain out of bounds, and the voices of women who often simultaneously resisted colonial repression and immense social pressure for daring to step into a dangerous territory such as prison would remain unheard. Now, before I move on to the next stage, next section, I would just take a minute to change the slide. Is it showing up?
Yes, ma'am.
Is the next slide showing up? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay. I shall now move on to discussing the narratives generated from female wards in late colonial Bengal by women political prisoners. As we all know, the nature of respectable Hindu women's political participation in the first decade of the 20th century had broadly taken three forms: the ability to inspire those within and outside the kinship nexus to patriotism, sympathetic support, and limited participation within the framework of the family. As these women contributed to the Swadeshi movement in their traditional roles as mothers, wives, and sisters, they earned the approval of the liberal men of their class. In the next decade, they began emerging collectively to demand their rights as citizen subjects and forming women's networks in district towns.
Excuse me, ma'am. Your PPT
Yes?
is not showing. Your PPT is
Oh.
not showing.
Can you not see the slide? Somebody just told me that it was visible.
Now it's visible.
Oh, okay. Thanks for pointing out. Please tell me when it just goes off. I am a little unfamiliar with sharing screen on Google Meet. You can see it now, right?
Yes, now it is visible.
It's visible? Okay. The liberal reformers did not see much potential in such work upsetting the status quo between the sexes and the classes. But things started changing during the non-cooperation movement, with Bashanti Devi, the wife of Bengal Congress leader C.R. Das, and Urmila Devi, his sister, joining a Congress demonstration and getting arrested in December 1921 in Calcutta. With the arrest of these elite women, there was uproar not only all over Bengal, but in the rest of the country too. The impact was such that apprehending more women to come out onto the streets to join non-violent protests, liberal reformists like Ramananda Chatterjee, editor of Probashi and Modern Review, tried to set norms for respectable women's participation in public life so that such participation did not make them less feminine, lead to the neglect of their responsibilities towards home and family, and enable easy mixing of young men and women whose backgrounds were doubtful and cultural norms different. Ramananda Chatterjee wrote in a piece in Probashi entitled The Arrest of Women, explaining that, quote, "It is for two reasons that we do not approve of women of our country doing any justifiable work which might lead to arrest and imprisonment. A woman in custody could be subject to unbearable insult and dishonor by either Indian or European civil servants, and although we do not object to women taking up any rightful activity if necessary, Nevertheless, we do not think that participating in any form of struggle is suitable to those who mother children." Unquote. This anxiety around the kind of women's participation that could lead to the possibility of arrest signals the birth of a new subject, the avowedly political woman. We may recall here that from mid to late 19th century Bengal, going to school was regarded as dangerous for girls, not only because of proselytizing campaigns were feared, but also female participation in the public system of education meant exposing them to lustful men on the way to school and to male teachers, however old and pious. It also meant that girls would occupy public spaces for some time every day, and it would leave them free to form ties with friends or teachers who do not belong to their kin group. In the opening decades of the 20th century, when going to school had become desirable for girls of respectable families, a new sight emerged as perilous. As educated women were taking part in anti-colonial protests publicly with men and were ready to suffer arrest, torture, and imprisonment, the role of women in politics came to be much debated. While Gandhi himself urged women to take part in passive resistance because of their inherent capacity for non-violence, guidelines were constantly issued regarding the preferred form and domain of middle-class women's public work and limits imposed on their participation. But even a very dignified and womanly way of public protest held out the threat of arrest and imprisonment. Prisons had been seen as sites of pollution for the caste Hindu woman, where they could lose their caste and be forced to violate religious taboos. Now they were considered dangerous public spaces where women might be subject to torture and sexual abuse by men. They might be forced to resort to violence to protect their honor. They might be kept in wards with petty women criminals who came from other social classes and could be subject to jail dress and jail diet not befitting their class. When advised to keep away from overtly political work didn't work, remedial measures were suggested to control the damage on those women who were already active in politics. Let me share an example. After Shanti Ghosh and Shuniti Chaudhuri, two 14-year-old girls, shot dead the Kumilla District Magistrate C.B. Stevens in December 1931, they were given life imprisonment in consideration of their age. Commenting on the judgment, opinion makers suggested that the two young girls should be given plenty of good books to read by jail authorities so that chances of moral deterioration setting in the company of hardened criminals is reduced. Male anxieties around women's imprisonment may have been compounded with the news of a couple of Bengali Hindu women being imprisoned in the 1910s for aiding activities of revolutionary groups quite a few years before women's en masse participation and courting of arrests in the Gandhian movements of 1920s. In 1917, the first woman state prisoner, Nonibala Devi, a child widow from Howrah of Bengal, without much social capital except her high caste, who had been daringly aiding a secret revolutionary party against huge odds, used to be suffocated in an airless punishment cell for some time every day and was also severely tortured with red chili paste smeared on her genitals to extract information about the revolutionaries she was helping. When she was released in 1919, Nonibala was ostracized for absconding with male revolutionaries in the course of work and for going to jail and bringing dishonor to her family. She died in penury some years later. Dukuribala Devi, her contemporary in prison, was a married woman from Birbhum and had young children. When Dukuribala came out after serving 2 years in prison, her husband refused to live with her and remarried. Durgamuni Pine, another widow from Kodipur with grown-up sons, found herself homeless and a social outcast when she returned to her native village after fleeing house arrest in Dhaka. These were the prices that women arrested in the 1910s were paying for defying social norms in the course of the country's struggle for independence. Records show us that things didn't change much for many women political prisoners attached to revolutionary societies in the 1930s and 40s who didn't come from well-placed families and were placed under Division 3 and had to serve rigorous sentences. A case in point is Savitri Devi of Dholghat, Chittagong, who was arrested in 1932 for daring to give shelter to the leader of Indian Republican Army, Surya Sen, and a few members of his group. Savitri, a middle-aged widow, and her son Ramkrishna suffered rigorous imprisonment, and the son died due to medical negligence in custody. Savitri was abused and humiliated while serving her term and not granted permission to see her ailing son until he was dead. Upon release and return to her Dholghat home, she faced extreme economic hardship and social ostracization. Such women hardly ever appear in prison literature penned by their male compatriots, perhaps because of two reasons. Men segregated in the male wards could hardly get wind of what was going on in the female ward of prisons, and also because most of them were generally dismissive of the varied contribution of women, except of course of the role of a handful of women in leading positions. Fellow revolutionaries of Ullashkar Dotto and Jyotish Pal, both of whom became mentally unwell as a result of the torture inflicted on them, discuss in their memoirs the tragic accounts of what happened to Ullashkar and Jyotish during incarceration. But the nature of state repression that women like Shobharani Dotto were subjected to after being arrested for having given shelter to Ujjwala Majumdar, who had attempted to assassinate Bengal Governor John Anderson in 1934, remains shrouded in mystery till date. We do not know why Shobharani had to be sent from Kolkata's Presidency Jail to the government mental asylum in Ranchi for a year, and what led to the spinal injury that disabled her from walking when she was finally released in 1937. It is only by tapping into her family history handed down orally that I could gather Shobharani had spent the last 13 years of her life in bed, unable to walk from 1937 to 1950. And of course, there was no question of the likes of Nonibala Devi leaving behind testimonies of abuse, the kind of which we get for the first time in the 1950s, when Ila Mitro, a leader of the Tibhaga movement, recorded the testimony of sexual abuse and torture on her when she was under arrest in East Pakistan. Unheard voices of Nonibala, Dukuribala, Durgamuni, Savitri, and many others become faintly audible to us only through written narratives of educated young women political prisoners like Kamala Dasgupta, Veena Das, Kalyani Bhattacharjee, Shanti Sudha Ghosh, Shanti Das, Kalpana Dotto, Shuroma Ghatok, and others. Okay, so here are some of the women I have just mentioned. Can you see? Is the screen visible?
Yes,
Are
they
the
are visible.
photos visible? Okay.
Yes, visible, ma'am.
Okay. And then I quickly move on to the next set of photos. Okay, here. Okay, so I go back to reading now. Please tell me if, again, the screen stops. I think I'll keep this on and then okay. I shall now briefly dwell on two more significant aspects of prison memories shared by the handful of women I have just mentioned. All of them were behind bars post-1920s, when conditions of captivity were considerably better, giving the inmates time and space for reading, writing, and reflection. This is especially true. The prison turning into a significant site for observation and representation of the subaltern classes that I've alluded to earlier is especially true of political women who devoted large chunks of their memoirs to discussing the plight of female convicts who came from hugely deprived sections of society. Coming in day-to-day contact with women of subaltern social groups for the first time in their lives had a profound impact on most of these women political workers. The oppression of these convicts, who were doubly victimized because of their class and gender, disturbed most of the political women greatly and had a bearing on their politics in later life. Veena Das, in her statement before the Special Tribunal of the Calcutta High Court, set up to try her for attempting to shoot the Bengal governor Stanley Jackson in 1932, had remarked that one of the reasons for her frustration with the colonial regime had been outrages committed on political prisoners, including, within quotes, the ignominy that was hurled on my honours graduate sister Kalyani Bhattacharya in the latter's prison life, unquote. Later, 9 years of imprisonment had made Veena change her standpoint. It taught her what a great leveler prison was, and coming out in March 1939, she decided to work among the women laborers in rice mills of Calcutta. The women who wrote about life in prison had also been deeply disturbed by the nexus of corruption among the jail authorities in the rigidly hierarchized prison system, depicting multiple instances of corruption rampant among the administrators of female wards, which ensured that prisoners, especially the resourceless convicts, are deprived of the meager provisions earmarked for them by the state. The writers drew attention to the system of subjecting the prisoners also to various forms of brutality. They recounted instances of organizing united protests involving the entire female ward through strategies like refusal of food for a whole day, against brutalities like beating up of old and ailing women convicts, or forcing someone unwell into meeting daily production targets of grinding dal or spices in the Khatuni Ghar or penal labor room. Poignantly telling the life stories of women unjustly thrust into jail for accidentally killing a violent husband, or trapped in a petty case by relatives who conspire to deprive a widow from property rights, these memoirs offer critiques of patriarchy as well. It is telling that these helpless women who had to silently endure deprivation and humiliation every single day thought of the prison as Dukkher Ghar, or house of sorrow, which is akin to the concept of Shoshur Ghar, or house of in-laws for women, where, in contrast to the reception that men receive at their in-laws, no one knows how much sorrow might be awaiting a woman. The narratives show that the writers wished to do something concrete to help these less fortunate others when the country won freedom, but they didn't question the validity of classification of prisoners according to social and educational status, or of the role of the welfare state. Kamala Dasgupta, in her Shadin Bharate Karagar, clearly outlined a reformist plan with better food, better medical care, and recreational facilities for the ordinary women convicts and under trials. But she never questioned the penal system. Shuroma Ghatok, in her prison memories of 1942, entitled Shillong Jail Diary or Diaries from Shillong Jail, wrote about ways to improve the lot of the Khasi women who came to jail for bootlegging or doing sex work. We notice a tendency to talk down in this particular prison diary a liberal bourgeois reformist attitude about the changes that these women need to make in their lifestyles. But in most of the other narratives, there is a sense of bonding with the women who are being written about. It is palpable that memories of Ashia, Fulmoni, Johara, or Habluz Ma continued to haunt them while these political activists took up the pen a few years after independence. In the absence of any direct testimony of the prison experiences of ordinary women, these second-hand narratives infused with the writer's own concerns gives the subaltern some agency and upholds the middle-class political workers' ability to confront oppression and injustice in the colonial prison. However, it was not until the prison notebooks of Nakshal women like Munakhi Sen and Joya Mitro were published that we see a powerful critique of both class and patriarchy in the institution of prison. Bonding with fellow political prisoners and forming sisterhood collectives is another significant aspect of their prison lives, and I wish to talk about this a little before closing. Prison spawned new friendships and a close bonding between political prisoners across parties in a way that would not have been possible otherwise. In the world outside, younger recruits, mostly male and a few female, would be usually honor-bound to pledge allegiance and loyalty to the dadas who recruited them and trained them initially. However, in prison, a common enemy, the British Empire and the jail authorities representing that empire, was reason enough to draw women belonging to rival political factions closer together. Enclosed within the prison walls year after year and separated from their families and their leaders, these inmates depended on each other for emotional and other forms of support in sickness and in health. They nursed each other during illnesses, entertained each other with music, poetry, and plays, protested together against corrupt prison staff and discriminatory jail rules, and engaged in dialogues on emerging trends in national and world politics and on their methodologies of work. Fostering a feeling of solidarity, this space also inspired independent thinking and initiatives on the part of the sisters, most of whom were used to following instructions given by dadas or big brothers who were unit heads of revolutionary groups in Bengal. The launching of the periodical Mondira happened to be one such autonomous endeavor, the idea of which originated in prison between Kalyani Das and Kamala Mukherjee. Many years ago, its first editor, Kamala Mukherjee, had told me in an interview, quote, "In 1937, when I was in Hijli detention camp, Kalyani and I discussed the idea of launching a journal to raise political awareness among women. She did in fact hand me 1,000 rupees later, with which we started Mondira after our release from prison," unquote. Kamala Mukherjee talks of a time when she was imprisoned for partaking of seditious activities as a member of the Juganto Revolutionary Party. After release in 1938-39, most of them were released between 38 and 39, Mondira appeared in April 1938, and its inaugural issue had two poems on the very first page dedicated to the memory of Monolata Dasgupta and Prafulla Nolini Brahmo, detainees who had died in the mid-1930s due to lack of timely medical attention in prison by their sisters in arms who launched the journal. We do not know if these two poems were composed jointly or singly, because these women have retained their anonymity, identifying themselves only as ex-political prisoners. This is an important statement, not only because it makes visible Bonolata and Profulla Nolini, who are otherwise hidden from history, but also because it speaks of sisterhood and solidarity that the four walls of the prison fostered. Let me show you. I have got this page here. Can you see it? Where the two poems were published in Mondira, dedicated to the two women who died. Yeah, okay, thanks. Prison narratives in general occupied an important place in Mondira, as is evident from Amulendu Dasgupta's Detinue and Kollani Das's Some Years in Prison, serialized in the first few issues of the monthly. A few letters that Kalpana Dattu and Beena Dash had written from prison were also published here and gave the readers some idea of the kind of readings that engaged these political prisoners in their years of detainment. Rani Chando, the writer and artist from Shantiniketan, who went to prison for the first time while partaking in the 1942 Quit India movement, wrote of her time in jail in the narrative aptly titled Janana Patak, or Female Ward. Kamala Dasgupta, who became the journal's second editor, herself wrote an extensive treatise on the nature of prison reform necessary in free India, to which I have referred to earlier. Ironically, when the British left and the country was partitioned, the women political workers who had launched Mondira and were running it since 1938 were replaced by an all-male editorial committee, and the writings of women that continued to appear in the periodical were either poetry or fiction or prose pieces on issues considered womanly. Essays on politics, society, and nation building were contributed by those who were big brothers to the little sisters in the political field, making it seem as if the women who had founded and nurtured the journal had never taken part in the political struggle to free the country. Though the idea of Mondira was born in prison with the intention of raising political consciousness of a lot more women, a near total closure of the discursive space that had been carved out by them shows us that given the gendered structure of the political organizations to which they belonged, the freedom to grow and evolve, think independently, and take new initiatives that the sisters had done, while in the larger prison that was colonial India, and also while confined physically in a brick and mortar prison, were not necessarily available to them in free India and under the open sky. But that's another story, and the trajectory of which can be shared another time. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for your fascinating presentation on prison narratives. We have a few questions in the chat box.
Yes.
Anjan Shaha, one of the participants, has asked this question: was the Division 1 status accorded to Gandhi nationalists only and never to revolutionary terrorists in the colonial era?
Well, very, very rarely, I would say. To the revolutionary from Bengal or Punjab, I don't think, maybe one or two rare examples. Some of them in the 1930s and 40s, after the prison reforms came about, some of them, or many of them, I would say, were put in Division 2 if their educational and social status that they belonged to sort of, made them avail Division 2. Most of them were under Division 2, rarely in Division 1.
Okay. Thank you. And another question, does the division of prisoners into different categories still remain?
Yes, it does. The prison system is still very much hierarchized in India. It does.
Is there any more question from any participant? I think, ma'am, there is no question, so we can end this program. I convey my heartfelt thanks to you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.